Hello, welcome to the next session in our Future of Work Summit. I'm Chris Cook. I'm a contributing editor and partner here at Tortoise. I think by this point, I'm sure you're all used to the shtick on what a thinking is, but the idea is we're here to have a sort of open discussion in which we're going to invite your opinions as well as the opinions of our experts. My colleague Zav has introduced himself, I think, in the chat already. If there's something that you say that's particularly interesting in the chat that you don't want to say on camera, that's fine, but you do run the risk that I will try to persuade you to come on camera at some point. The idea of this is obviously, as if you've been to previous sessions, you'll realize is we're supposed to be having a conversation akin to an editorial discussion at a newspaper. We're trying to work out what we know, what we don't know, what we agree on, and what we can disagree on. And we've got a really great set of experts to help us talk through these issues. Let's start with Francis O'Grady, who is the General Secretary of the Trade Unions Congress. Francis has been in that role since 2013. The TUC is the unions union, I guess you could say, the meta union, the organizing body for what I think I'm obliged at any conversation about trade unions to call this great movement of ours. But we've also got John Paul McHugh, who is from Community. Community is best known, I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong, John Paul, it's best, people think of it as a steel workers union, but it's actually a general union. You've got everyone in you from steel workers and industrial workers through to, you recently took over Voice, which is a little education union. We've also got Anna Stansbury, who's an academic, a PhD researcher from Harvard, who is a student of Inequality and recently has been giving talks in which I think we'll come to this, Anna, but you've been arguing about how worker power is an important part of the fight against inequality. I was wondering if we could start with Francis. In the slides, Francis, you may have noticed we pointed out the drop in union density since the 1960s, but we're going through, I saw the TUC yesterday or this morning boasting that the numbers are up, 100,000 new union members in the last year.
Chris, we never boast. We reported the fact that for 4 years in a row now, we've had a net increase in membership, and we're not hanging the flags out because this is tough work and tough work for our organisers in particular. You'll all have also have seen yesterday that Uber signed an agreement with one of our unions, another breakthrough in the gig economy. But it's tough because, as we all know, there's a clear association between falling union membership and growing inequality. We know that ever since the 80s, we've had a series of changes in the law that have made it more difficult for workers to have a voice, to show solidarity with each other. But nevertheless, yeah, I think we can draw hope, and maybe, just maybe, this is a sign that, you know, we're at one of those corners where the tide is going to turn. So
in my head, Francis, in my head, I have a sort of, my model of the British labour market has, if you like, the increase, there's a lot of sort of increasing precariousness is what it sort of feels like.
Yeah.
And it's driven, in my head, my model of the economy is more people are going into types of work that have always been precarious. So what we now call the gig economy, where people on piecework, basically, that's always existed, but it's growing as a sector. And then at the other end of the spectrum, we've got people, if you like, in traditional, conventional jobs, and their terms and conditions, their sort of labour market regulation has got looser for them, so they have fewer workplace rights. Is that the right sort of, is that the way to think of the model?
Well,
is that a fair
I think we've seen these big shifts, haven't we, over a long period of time, including that shift between more services, less industry, particularly in the 1980s, and no doubt we can debate that, but you know, a real kind of, in my view, complete destruction, vandalism of industries that did have a really important future, and the growth of services. We've also seen that real shift towards insecure contracts. Critically, we've seen people's real living standards stagnating over this period. So even when we're told, I think it was OECD or PwC, I will double check, but we're going to see these massive increases in productivity gains from the deployment of artificial intelligence alone, and yet workers' share of that, we've still got to have that big debate, I believe, about what's in it for workers. And there are lots of positive ways that could benefit working lives, but we've seen those big shifts. We've seen kind of, I think the social contract has also frayed. There's, if you like, what you get in your pay packet, but it's also the support that you need that is still there in other countries. If you've got childcare issues or caring issues, that idea of a social wage has kind of been diminished over many decades in Britain. So you've got kind of people who are feeling pretty worried about the future, that real risk of deepening inequalities between those at the top and everybody else, but also one kind of fact I just throw out to you, which struck me in terms of working from home during this pandemic. 70% of people in Richmond-on-Thames work from home. In Burnley, the figure 14%. And yet, you read the media, you would think this was an experience for everybody, whereas probably the more typical picture is that people, the typical worker is delivering to a small number of people who are working from home.
Can I ask, just my colleague Zav has just asked about how the demographics of the union movement is at the moment, and I just wonder about, has the growth over the last 4 years been making you younger, or are you recruiting sort of more people in traditionally unionized sectors, or are you seeing growth? You're going to tell me both, but can you tell me?
Yeah, it has been different in different years. The uniting trend is that more women are joining. Okay. We're a majority female movement now. I think that's quite significant in terms of our history, and I'd love to see that reflected at the top of the trade union movement. Has just elected its first woman general secretary, Christina McHugh, who's just fantastic. So it would be great to see some more of that happening. But I think in some years we have managed to make breakthroughs into private service sector areas, quite low paid and insecure areas. In other years, this last year, I think it's been the public sector where that's the picture really, has been a consolidation, if you like, of membership in the public sector.
Okay, so I've seen the National Education Union has been a big gainer of the last sort of.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing I personally find really exciting is they held a single Zoom call which 400,000 people called into. Now, for me, this is kind of exciting stuff in terms of new ways to organise, new ways to reach people, but also with our existing membership to have a different kind of relationship. But this is the 21st century equivalent of the penny newspapers at the turn of the last century. Perhaps, I hope, that could really help us reach workers in new and better ways. I'm not envious of whoever had to moderate the chat. Can we go to? Thank you so much, Francis. Can we go to John Paul now? So, I mean, John Paul, your members, I think it's fair to say your members are, what characterizes them is they're generally people in, if you like, traditional industries. So you don't have sort of gig economy workers really as a major part of your current membership. Is that fair?
Not really.
Oh, really? Okay, there we
are. So about 2.5 years ago, Chris, as a union, we launched a automation commission. And that was to fundamentally bring and be able to articulate some argument in regards to where a sort of traditional membership existed and some of the challenges that they were going to be facing. in terms of automation. But it was also about trying to position us in the wider world of work and how it was changing. But it was also about, as well, trying to bring a voice to what we seen as a massive opportunity as trade unionists, and that was the self-employed itself. A group of workers, the length and breadth of the nation, which are very much unrepresented, and more importantly, is a growing sector of the economy as well. So in seeing your point, I get where you're coming from, but no, we purposely took decisions a number of years ago to try and position ourselves into that area where we started to sort of focus our attention towards how the world of work was changing. Sorry about this.
Sorry. And I mean, one of the things I'm sort of interested in about I think the gig economy questions are quite sort of well understood. I wonder whether, I suspect most people don't, and I certainly don't have a good grasp on, if you like, what are the existing traditional, for want of a better word, I haven't got a good word for you, like a traditional job. What are the issues that are still coming up with your reps? Or, you know, what are the, if you could sort of fix 4 or 5 things, you know, overnight, even sort of setting aside the gig economy issues, what do you think there would be?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, and sort of like, you know, really going back to sort of traditional areas, and something that's probably been featured in the press over the last number of years, and certainly something Francis has had to support us with quite considerably over the last number of years, is actually protecting the key foundation industries that we have within the country. You know, the infrastructure that builds a nation and builds manufacturing. So, you know, when we come and start to look at that challenge, we're very much looking towards how government apply their self. And again, how much responsibility businesses accept in regards to their role in that. And that is about infrastructure, it is about opportunity, it's about procurement, it's about having industrial strategies that interlink with other areas. It's about recognising, yeah, the economy's changing and when to move more towards servicing in certain areas. But as a nation, we still fundamentally have to be able to perform in a global market. So, you know, it's about all those areas. Clearly, when you start to look at the areas, it's about protecting employment. It's equally as well, again, in terms of this argument, in terms of technology, it's about making sure that they're part of that discussion in terms of technology. And again, recognising, and I think it was somebody in the previous session was talking about lifelong learning. You know, within the industries, you've got to be able to actually develop to how the automation, you know, the machinery of actual production is changing. You've got to be part of that equation. You know, an example I would give you, particularly sort of pertaining to the steel industry, if you look at a firm in Austria, Osteplan, I think the name is, they moved from traditional blast furnaces to electric arc. They went from 1,000 employees to 4 employees in that transition, but nobody lost their jobs. What they've done is they redirected that labour into data science and other areas. You know, they've built a new workforce which makes them more sustainable, but even more so more competitive in a global market. You know, within the UK, we've got governments that are cutting funding towards skills. You know, we've just seen recently the demise of the Union Learning Fund within England. We still have it within Wales. We still have it within Scotland. You know, that's not just a disadvantage to trade unionism. That's a disadvantage to this country and to business. And these things are fundamental, you know. And, you know, just sort of finishing in that point, I was afforded about a year ago so to go to the Warwick Innovation Centre, basically where the robots make the robots. And when I went in there and I come back out and I think about trade unionism, and I think about the responsible role of trade unionism in the workplace, and I come away from that and I think a wee bit about power versus employer, and again, that's part of this conversation. Let me say that the power lies with technology when you come out of that room. And that's what we're facing. And we need to be recognised in that regard. We need to build our membership, and clearly, you know, Francis is right. I mean, she's saying she's not going to boast. I think we should, because I think this is a result of the way that the trade union movement conducted itself through the pandemic, as well as anything.
I mean,
we showed, that we're just a force for good. We're actually a force, a credible force to actually support a nation in a time of trouble. So I think these types of things are important. And clearly within that traditional areas, it's still the same. You're fighting for terms and conditions to protect terms and conditions. Yes, there's new terms and conditions that are emerging, and automation brings about these things. But fundamentally, you're protecting and fighting to reserve and secure an industry.
Thanks ever so much. Anna, can we come to you next? So part of your research, Anna, has been about the role of organised labour within inequality more broadly. Mm-hmm. And our sort of essay question for the day, or for this bit, is about power and within the workplace. Do you think it's possible to? Is there a route to this that doesn't go through unions?
I'm pretty skeptical that there's a route that doesn't go through unions. I think what we've seen looking at many countries around the world, so my research focuses on the US and the UK, but also looks at other industrialized economies, is that the union movement broadly seems to be the form of worker organizing and worker power that has consistently delivered reductions in inequality, as well as improvements in worker voice in a meaningful way in workplaces. And what that movement looks like in different countries differs. In the US and the UK, there's typically been this model of unionism where bargaining is typically, and power is typically exercised at the level of a firm or an establishment. And in some of the continental European countries, the model is much more multi-level, where ingrained in law in countries like Germany, Austria, are sectoral level bargains between groups of unions and groups of employers. But broadly speaking, I think everything that at least I've looked at in my research suggests that you need empowered workers, and empowered workers in a way that is protected by law, in order to redress the sort of intrinsic power relation in the employment relationship. And unions, broadly construed, are the most effective way to do that.
Can I ask, is there to sort of put this in crudish terms, if you were to see an increase in union density in the US and UK, what do you think like the sort of probable first order effects you'd see would be? Can I just ask in your mental model, what happens when you grow the unions?
So I think to a first order, it matters quite a lot whether you're talking about growing public sector or private sector unions as to exactly what effects you'll expect to see. And as Francis alluded to, one of the biggest and kind of most striking shifts in both the US and the UK over recent decades has been that unions are now predominantly public sector, and that public sector union density is very high and private sector union density is very low. So in terms of the private sector, is what one would expect to see with increase in union membership, I think, is an increase in the pay or the quality of working conditions for the workers that are in the unions, as well as, particularly if the firms that the workers are unionizing in are profitable, some redistribution of the proceeds of that employment to the workers. I mean, under the basic conception of unionization, one of the macroeconomic concerns about an increase in union density is whether this would reduce employment levels. And I think the jury is still a bit out on the degree to which that would happen. But my read of the research is that the outcome would be substantially net positive for workers, in that the gains that workers would receive in terms of pay, better compensation, better benefits would outweigh any possible other negative effects. I think it's also important to note, just quickly, that the benefits of a high level of union density within an industry or a place tend to flow not just to the workers that are in the union, but also to the workers that are outside the union in other similar firms or industries. And that's because of an effect that is called, rather ominously, but the union threat effect in academia. But the idea is that you're operating in the same labor market. And so the presence of a union bringing up working conditions and compensation in your sector exerts a sort of competitive labor market pressure on the other firms to do the same, and also to do the same in order to preempt unionization and union action at their own firm. And so you see these evidence of big spillover effects of unionization that increase the bigger union density is.
That's such, in journalism, the managers most scared of unions are the ones who pay the best. as a general rule.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Can I ask about, so I think one of the things that's really striking, I think British people understand the idea of firm level negotiation, even quite sort of significant house agreements that contain very significant constraints on management. I always feel like moving to a model of industry level, so say every newspaper had to follow a sort of similar thing, is a bridge that would be really politically difficult to cross. I feel like it's an intuitive thing, but I feel like the politics would be really difficult. I just wonder whether you think if you know of any evidence about the effect of that firm level versus industry level difference.
Yeah, so this is actually one of the topics I'm really interested in from a research perspective, and with the caveat that it's difficult because when you're comparing firm level bargaining to industry level bargaining, you're comparing fundamentally different economic systems. You can't compare everything else like for like and just switch the level. But when you compare the effects of bargaining in the UK, US versus countries with sectoral bargaining like Germany, I think there are a couple of things that stand out to me. The first is that most sectoral bargaining countries have seen substantially more resilience in union membership over time than most enterprise level bargaining countries. Now, as I said, you're not holding everything else constant. There have been changes in the policy environment in the UK and the US that have also led to it to become much more difficult to organize. But there's a possibility that sectoral level bargaining means that when there's some kind of shock that's hitting an industry, globalization being a good example for manufacturing, the competitive advantage that a firm can gain from not being unionized in a firm level bargaining system is much greater than in a sectoral level bargaining system where there's a flaw. And so a firm level bargaining system can create economic incentives for firms to really, really fight unionization in a way that a sectoral bargaining system may not if the floor is imposed across the whole industry, whether or not workers are unionized at a given firm. I'd be interested in hearing whether the views of the other panelists differ on that, but that seems to be where my read of the research is.
Okay, thanks ever so much. I wonder if we could come back to Francis. One of the things I'm sort of, the sort of the essay question for this session is about power and winning and rights and how the lines will be drawn where. Do you think that is sectoral bargaining something that is on the agenda? Is it like a long grass idea? The thing is, like, if you think through British history, even things like sector-wide bodies for agreeing training are a bit contentious and difficult to put together. It feels like it's a thing that's inconceivable, basically, politically to me. Am I wrong?
Well, your guess is as good as mine in terms of the current government, but it's been on our agenda for a good long while. In fact, throughout our history, we've had sectoral agreements. Some of those have changed, some of those have been torn up, but we're certainly continuing to push for that sectoral level machinery. And of course, it is completely politically feasible. Lots of countries offer this, having that multi-tier approach to bargaining. New Zealand has just introduced sectoral bargaining to provide that floor and confidence for workers across the piece. And my sense is that it's becoming more urgent. If you look at what's happened, not just with the gig economy, but at the sharp end of particularly services in this country, it's almost become a kind of laboratory for business models and employment practices that are completely exploitative. There's no other word for describing it, but I think what we've all had to learn as a general workforce is that that's a laboratory, mainly Black and ethnic minority and migrant workers on the sharp end in the gig economy, but those practices have spread to other parts of the workforce. We saw that with fire and rehire. Frankly, I have to say I was completely gobsmacked by certain employers taking the opportunity of a pandemic to tear up people's hard-won rights and employ them on less money when there was absolutely no rationale to do so, other than if we can get away with it, we will. So we've seen, those sorts of false self-employment, 0 hours contracts, insecurity, and deep kind of divisions in terms of certainly the way kind of women and Black workers are treated. And I think there is an appetite to push back against that. And we have to do that in lots of different ways. Sectoral agreements would be one way, just to provide that kind of reassurance that was spoken about when wages councils were first introduced. Not only is it important because workers are human beings who deserve dignity and decency at work, but it's about stopping the decent employer being undercut by the bad.
Yeah. John Paul, I wonder if we could come to you. I mean, one of the things is we'll go to one of our guests in a moment, but one of the things that I'm sort of interested in is what the union movement sometimes refers to as political education, which I always feel sounds quite ominous. But the thing I'm sort of interested in is whether the culturally you find recruiting members sort of easy or hard, or what the misconceptions and the conceptions that people have of unions are, and whether culturally unions are in the right place where that the union movement needs to be.
Yeah. Happy to answer. Come on now. I just wanted to just pick up, just if you don't mind, just ever so slightly in Anna's question in terms of sectorial. I think clearly there is an appetite and there has been an agenda, as Francis rightly says. But I think it's also important to know that in my view, there has to be a recognition within the movement that there is smaller niche unions that need to be part of that type of equation as well, because there is a potential to then bigger unions just swallowing up other unions through a sectorial type framework. And it's clearly something that has to be recognised, and clearly the importance, and sort of leading on to your other point, is about trade unionism being relevant to people, regardless of what job they do. And clearly when you start to look at that sort of political education, right now we still continue to face the stories within media, certainly not talking about Tortoise in that regard, but we see, we continue to see stories within media where they try and shape trade unionism in sometimes a negative way, which very much then forms people's views. Clearly, the generations have changed and we are attracting more and more younger workers into the movement. Clearly, we're attracting more and more women into the movement. And again, these things will help shape us as an organisation to become more attractive and more relevant to that type of membership. But again, I think it comes back to again, when you start to think about sort of the big issues in this country, the big things that require the decision makers to sit down and make the right decisions, the more that we can push trade unionism towards being part of that decision making, then the more we will see people actually stepping up and then saying, right, there's the value streams, there's this. It's not transactional. It's about actually hearing somebody's voice, capturing that view, and then articulating it back, ensuring that the decision makers are making these decisions, knowing how workers genuinely feel about the challenges that they're having to face. So, as I say to you, I think it is about us as a movement, but the responsibilities don't just lie with us as a movement. They lie with employers and they lie with government. And it's about them acting in a particular way. And again, that comes back to the point that's been made by the other two panelists in terms of looking at the comparison between sectorial arrangements or firm arrangements. There has been people, many businesses, length and breadth of this country, that have seen an opportunity and a disaster to try and undermine terms and conditions. We should be in an environment where people feel threatened to actually go down that road. They don't, they're relaxed. Right. It's down to us as trade unionists to try and stop them. It shouldn't just be down to us as trade unionists to try and stop them.
Can I ask about, we're about to come to one of our panelists, but as I said, but one of the I think if you were to, my sort of unevidenced prejudice is that that they trade unionism in Britain is still a is still sort of seen as there's a sort of 1970s hangover thing about trade unionism for some people, and there's I'm thinking in terms of, sort of how when you recruit people and the obstacles to recruitment, and I wonder whether the other thing you sometimes hear is, I really wish trade unions did more like, and then people describe everything trade unions do like Union Learn, and they spent less time doing politics. And you have to sort of say to people, they do all of that other stuff. They just have to do the politics as well, so that will work. But it's quite a hostile culture to trade unionism, isn't it, ours?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I think Frances is charming at the bit to come in this as well, and I'm sure she is. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. When I left school, I went to work with a union card in my pocket. Nobody had to come up and talk to me about that. I worked within a workplace where there was 100% density. 23 years later, when I left that workplace, I got a job with the TUC Academy. I don't know nothing else other than trade unionism. So for me, it was certainly different. For my daughter, my son, for my daughter, it was there. It was something that was very much part of her job as being an intensive care paediatric nurse. For my son, who went into a profession in terms of quantity surveying, it's something that he's never felt he has to join, but it's not there for him to join. But he is politically motivated. So again, it's about us as a movement ensuring that we've got not just a product that goes beyond just the sort of traditional areas. And clearly we're hearing some sort of, real positive news in terms of what's happened around about the gig economy, Uber and GMB, and we can continue to build upon that. But it is also about us recognising that as a marketplace for us as trade unionists out there, and actually providing a voice back to workers. It doesn't need to be all about transactional arrangements in terms of professionalism or in terms of associations. It doesn't need to be about benefits. It can be about what this was built on, and that's values.
Great. Can we go to, thanks, John Paul. Can we go to Jen Allerton? Because,
yeah. Hey.
Hi, Jen. So you made a couple of points about what I guess I'd say like an obstacle to union membership for you. Is that a fair summary?
Yeah, I guess sort of. So it's like my experience from my own education, but also from having a background in communication and engagement, particularly with schools, and that's from a sort of science communication background. But I noticed like the gaps that exist, and for me, one of the things, like, it was interesting hearing John talk about leaving school with a union card in his pocket, because I through my education I had a sort of sense of the history of unions, but not any idea of their modern day place in the world and what they could do for me, why I would want to join one. We got a little bit of financial education at school and other types of the sort of personal, social, health education bits that you have, but I had, so it kind of left me with this idea that unions were something either that had already done the work of achieving workers' rights, and that's great, but that's part of history, or they were something for those specific sectors. So you might be part of a teachers' union or a union for civil servants, or whatever sector you're in, and where that put me if I'm just in a job in a sector outside of that. And I can't, there were a couple of other points, but yeah.
Well, Frances, what do you make of that? I'm really struck. So yesterday we had the Uber signed an agreement with the GMB, with the general union, the GMB, and I wonder if, the unions have often operated with quite odd spheres where you wouldn't expect them. I've always found it odd that musicians have a union. Like it feels like such a difficult thing to unionize. They literally
it's really strong.
gig workers. Well, they're literally, they're so far from the traditional long-term contract sort of, stereotype of unionized workers.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine always used to say that, you know, for all the talk, at its heart, trade unionism is friendship between working people, that we look out for each other and look after each other. And we do, we organise in every walk of life. You know, we've got professional footballers, very strong union, which also, by the way, has a solidarity fund for footballers further down the tables. But we've, you know, factory workers, shop workers, climate scientists, I mean, you name it, we organise. But where I think, you know, what I heard from that contribution was that kind of perception of our unions for me, and we particularly hear that for young people. Like, I remember a young person saying to me, oh, I thought temporary workers couldn't join the union. Oh, yes, you can. You know, so clearly we've got to do more to get the message out, and we are trying new ways to do that. But I also think, you know, it would be naive not to recognise we've had 40 years of a particular way of looking at the world that was about individualizing people, atomizing the workforce, you know, kind of attacking the only organizations that were left of working people. You know, so none of this has happened by accident, in my view. But what I think is possible is that kind of, you know, I think amongst working people ourselves, what we see in many of the campaigns we run, people getting it, that, you know, yeah, you can try going it alone with the boss, but you're probably not going to get better pay, better health and safety, which is, you know, really top of people's agenda at the moment, skills, training, work-life balance, all of those issues. And critically, nobody's going to listen to you. So I think that kind of sense of actually how we find new ways to collectivize, including unionize, is the big challenge for us. Because to go back to just last point, your original question, which was about, could you see alternatives to trade unions? Well, you know, I think it's a bit like asking, can you see alternatives to democracy? Well, yeah, but it's not that attractive, you know, and I think there is something fundamental about having the right to a voice at work, you know, having that sense of dignity that you are not just listened to, but heard. And you only get that by joining together with other working people.
I mean, one of the things I always think is, I've made the point about I think it was Christine Blower once said to me, that who's a former teaching union leader, said to me that her meetings with Tory MPs always went, I really want you to be a friendly society. Why couldn't you be a friendly society? It's all of this other stuff that you do that we sort of dislike. But actually, yeah. one of the things that I sort of think is interesting is the extent to which the difficult things that unions do is all that people tend to know about them. And all of the things, union learn is a classic thing. So if you're an old hand in education like me, it's an annual story that a Tory government is going to get rid of union learn. And then someone has a conversation with them about what union learn actually does. And they think, oh, actually, we'd quite like to keep that.
Yeah.
Although it appears that Gavin Williamson has
finally
been the one to be talked
to. What a shame. No, but it also speaks to your other question about political education, because actually, if we don't have a political voice, I sincerely believe that we would not have had the furlough scheme, which wasn't perfect, but my God, you know, that was 10 million livelihoods at its peak that were saved. And that will allow, exactly as was being said before, is actually better for the country, because it's allowing us to bounce back quicker than otherwise would have been the case. You know, we wouldn't have unions like Community able to speak so eloquently and persuade that steel is not an old industry. It's a foundation industry that's critical to produce wind turbines and, you know, all the other green infrastructure that we need, but it needs support to make the technological leap to cut carbon. You know, so I think our political voice is actually really important, and we learned that when we first started as a trade union movement. You know, we obviously were key founders of the Labour Party, but in so many countries it's understood, yeah, of course, our values and our history may be with the Labour Party, but you know, we're grown-ups, we can all talk to each other, we don't have to agree on everything, but we should be able to have those political conversations too.
Thanks ever so much. Anna, just for finally, we're coming to the end of our 45 minutes. I mean, I was wondering if there's anything in there in particular about from the research that you've done about some of these sorts of cultural questions, about the not like the soft is the wrong word, but the non-legal barriers to union and unionization and worker power that we should maybe be thinking about as well.
Yeah, actually, this ties very well with what I wanted to say in response to the question and to Francis's comments. One of the things that strikes me so much about the way our society is organized and the way our perception of how we should be in this society is organized is that we are, on the whole, hopefully continue to be strongly committed to democracy and to the idea that everyone has a say in how we run our country, we run our town, we run our local area. And yet we're quite happy to accept the fact, on the whole, that the workplace is run as an autocracy, where perhaps managers consult workers, but workers, if there's no legal representation, no union or no workers on the board, have no formal right to challenge management decisions. And I think the idea that we carve out such a large part of our lives, accepting culturally that there should not be democracy in the workplace, is quite fascinating from a political and cultural point of view. And that doesn't have to be the case. And so I think thinking about unionism, not just as a movement to reflect, to gain benefits, as John Paul and Francis have both said, but also as a movement that promotes the concept of workplace democracy. And I think a media and a political culture and a social culture that promotes the idea that everyone has a valuable role to play and stake in the decisions that are made in the workplace, that's the kind of culture that can support and sustain trade unionism and support for trade unionism even outside unionized workers. So I think that's a really fundamental part of it. The other point I wanted to bring up is much more prosaic, but I'm a member of a union. The Harvard graduate student teachers are unionized. And this was a very controversial thing at the time. But the number of people that have come up to me since and have said, I'm so grateful we're in this union because our union fought for us not to have to go back into the workplace without safety protections during COVID. And the number of other people of my age, of my generation, in professions which are not typically unionized, who have started to have those conversations in their workplaces is quite remarkable. And so I also think being put into a position where people who generally haven't seen themselves have a particular impetus to take action realize that their lack of voice and power is dramatically affecting their lives at work. I think that can be a real catalyzing factor culturally for people to understand the value of a union and representation in the workplace.
Thank you ever so much. Thank you to you, Anna. Thank you to Francis, and thank you to John Paul. Also to Jen Allerton and Gregory and Andrew and Edwin and Tom and everyone who's contributed in the comments in the chat. I wasn't able to quite keep up with the volume. This is the final session of our Future of Work Summit, but for a wash up where we're going to have a chat about what comes next and where we take this. My colleague Liz Mosley, I think, is going to be
here. Hello.
Hello. We're literally in rooms next to each other, so this is
I think you're downstairs. I'm upstairs.
BBC experience. I will hand over to Liz. Thank you ever so much for your contributions, particularly John Paul, Anna, and Francis. And I will speak to you later.